Hello, I'm Bridget Byrne, Professor of Sociology at the University of Manchester and Director of the Centre on the Dynamics of Ethnicity, CODE, as it's also known. I'm very pleased to welcome you to this Reconstruction Work event organised by CODE and the Stuart Hall Foundation, which asks, can the museum be decolonised? But first, I want to tell you a little bit about CODE, the Centre on the Dynamics of Ethnicity, which is a research centre based at the University of Manchester, but bringing together colleagues from 10 universities across the UK. Our current research programme is looking at COVID, race and ethnic inequalities and seeks to provide a rapid response to the crisis posed by COVID-19 and its social, cultural and economic impact on racial and ethnic minorities. We're a multidisciplinary team using a range of different methods and seeking to provide robust evidence on the often lethal impact of racial and ethnic discrimination and inequality. We aim to provide new data in accessible formats to champion policy and institutional change by showing where and how racial inequality is present, how it builds on and extends existing patterns of inequality, and how this is experienced in everyday lives. We've launched what we hope will be the largest survey of its kind of ethnic and racial and religious minorities, how they've been impacted by the pandemic. This survey is called EVENS, the Evidence for Equality National Survey, and I'd encourage you to fill it in. I'll put a link in the chat. We're very clear at CODE that the impact of racial and ethnic discrimination and disadvantage are not one-off events, but processes that happen across the life course and across all aspects of the lives of individuals and communities. We want to understand how these processes work, but also working with a range of partners, we want to think about how communities are challenging discrimination and disadvantage, particularly in the wake of Black Lives Matter. We're really pleased to have this partnership with the Stuart Hall Foundation. We take on Stuart Hall's call for the aim of academic research on race and racism to change the world by challenging racial injustice and discrimination. So I hope you find it informative, and please follow CODE's work on Twitter, Instagram and the internet. You can also find links to recordings of past events we've collaborated with Stuart Hall Foundation on culture, policing the crisis, health and well-being, employment and young people through the Stuart Hall Foundation website. Today we wanted to host an event bringing together experts to talk about the future of the museum because of the particular place that they hold in producing representations of history and heritage and thus narrations of nation. There's been growing recognition over the last 20 years or so that museums as national cultural institutions should recognise and cater for all communities. But doing this raises questions of what museums are for, both in terms of the role they often play in maintaining notions of high culture and distinction and their relationship to colonial histories. The contemporary decolonial moment involves a reckoning with the fact that colonialism and the abuses of power that this entailed have played a significant role in shaping collections within museums, as well as ideas about what and who a museum is for. The need to address those parts of European museum collections which were obtained through colonial pillage and looting is gaining increasing momentum in what Dan Hicks describes as the scramble for decolonisation. It's increasingly being recognised how museums often hold the spoils of militarised colonialism, and even where the contents are not the product of brutal conflict, collections often reflect the acquisitive power and ordering thought of the colonial processes. Acts of collection and display have often been used to hold up notions of white supremacy, which in turn legitimated colonial and post-colonial power. This often involved representing colonised and racialised others in ways which were stereotypes and suggested inferiority. So the decolonial questioning of the museum has led to a rethinking of both the relationship with museum audiences and with curation. Not only what should be in collections, but who has the expertise to make decisions about how collections should be displayed. There's also an increasing recognition that objects will have different meanings and values to different audiences. This involves recognition that we do not enter the museum in the same ways. We bring different identities, histories, and positions in power structures with us as we enter or don't enter the museum. And this holds true for both those who work in museums and those who might potentially visit them or engage with them in other ways. There have been long-standing questions about what museums are for, whose heritage they preserve and celebrate, who should have the power to decide what a museum is and how it is displayed and accounted for. And these questions have been given extra impetus by protests around Black Lives Matter over the summer of 2021 and ongoing, summer of 2020 and ongoing, in the context of a pandemic which was exposing the life and death nature of inequalities, particularly race inequalities, both within the UK and globally. But at the same time, the museum sector remains a highly politicised space, with museums' attempts to address colonial past becoming a focus of criticism within the so-called culture wars. For example, UK Minister Oliver Dowden recently threatened funding cuts to those cultural institutions which removed controversial objects from display. So given this context, I'm very excited to hear what our contributors have to say. They all have different relationships to both the idea and the practice of museums. And I also look forward to hearing your responses as an audience. So I'm now going to hand over to Orsod Malik, who will chair the event.
Thanks, Bridget. Hi, everyone. I'm Orsod Malik. I'm the digital content curator at the Stuart Hall Foundation. And I'm really, really excited to bring you, or to be chairing, this conversation. The first thing is Sado Jirde was unable to join us this afternoon, but hopefully we'll have a chance to discuss some of her interventions into this particular topic, some of her brilliant interventions. And we'll kick off with a set of presentations from each of our speakers. And the first one will be delivered by Mohammed Ali, who is an award-winning artist, curator, and producer, and a trustee of Birmingham museums. He has been commissioned to work internationally with leading galleries, festivals, art centers, and theaters to produce large-scale murals in open spaces in the communities where people work, live, and play. Mohammed is the founder of Soul City Arts, a leading independent arts organization based in Birmingham that has worked with artists, academics, and activists from around the world to commission and present innovative exhibitions, performances, and digital installations. He has worked extensively in places like Kuala Lumpur, Melbourne, New York, and South Africa. So I'd like to invite Mohammed Ali to begin his presentation.
Okay, hi. Sound check, you can hear me, yeah?
Yes, yeah.
Let's see, from the start. Okay. As a graffiti artist, I always say, if only walls could speak, but I also say, who said they couldn't? Because I paint murals and I make walls speak. These walls we appropriate and take as a canvas to speak to future generations of the things they have seen, where art spills outside of these shiny white wall galleries and spill out onto the streets for all. It's the spirit of street art that I try to encompass in all of the work that I do in the different worlds that I straddle. If objects could speak, what would they say? We admire objects from places like Syria to learn about the ancient world, but switch off from the plight of the refugees. If these objects could speak, they would probably curse us. Quite simply, I would say we place people and communities as secondary, which I think is a tragedy. I've been a graffiti artist for about 20 years and I'm now currently a trustee at my city museum. Quite an unusual journey. Sorry, I think the slides keep jumping. How do I do that? How do I pause them? Yeah, I just pause. So yeah, I mentioned I've been a graffiti artist for about 20 years and it's an unusual journey to become a trustee. This unlikely journey really come about from a very personal angle, really. It wasn't professional or academic, but it was me delving into heritage and museums, which came about from a desire to reflect my community. And it was following the passing of my father, which I think you can see on the screen right now. Who was my father exactly? Where can I find out this information? And this information existed in the community, but who had captured it? People were too busy living their lives in these communities, making a living as working class immigrants. And I'm the son of a working class immigrant.
I'm so sorry to interrupt. We can't see your slides, unfortunately.
Okay, you don't see any of them at all?
No.
Okay, 1 second.
No worries.
Apologies. I don't know why that is. You don't see, what do you see on the screen?
I'm seeing you at the moment.
Oh, okay. Apologies. So let's start that. Now you should see it, right? Do you see something now?
Yes, yeah. So see your desktop background.
Okay, all right. I'm just going to jump back. No problem, no worries. So you didn't see any of the images, right?
No.
This, what you see on the screen, is one of my murals, and I was talking about being a graffiti artist, so I think that's self-explanatory. And then I talked about if objects could speak. I mentioned about war-torn countries, but how much emphasis do we place on people? And that's something I feel is a tragedy. So that was the image. This was my father, who I'd just spoken about, and actually the desire, as I'd mentioned, to reflect people. And it was really after the passing of my father that led me to the world of museum and the heritage world. So as I mentioned, coming from a working class background, immigrant background, our communities, they really never had time for kind of the museum space. People were too busy living their lives and trying to make a living, and they couldn't afford such a luxury to tell their own stories. And the museum wasn't a place that really had little or no value to our communities, including myself growing up. So what I'm sharing with you really is a personal lived experience, not from an academic's perspective. It's me as an artist, as a community figure, a person, and as also as a trustee. So I straddled quite a few different worlds. So I began a journey documenting the stories of people like my father through a project we launched called Knights of the Raj, that told untold stories of Britain's curry house pioneers, people like my father who came here in the 50s. And it was during that project that many of these people of these generations were dying off one by one, including my father. And many of the people that I'd interviewed were passing away, including, as you can see on this image here, my mother, who passed away from COVID earlier this year. And earlier this week, sadly, one of my father's first employers also passed away. So one by one, these people were dropping off. And this became a very personal thing for me to kind of see how the role of the museum became something deeply profound on a very personal level. And on the steps of the Birmingham Museum, I stand here, and I share with the audience that our community, that they didn't even think they were worthy of cleaning the steps of this museum. And now, through this exhibition that we had put on and gathered the people, we are now venerating them on the walls of this museum, but not just venerating them, but telling difficult stories of not just East meets West and how these people brought curry houses to the UK, but rather the racism and the difficult stories that even at the time, some people advised and said, you can't tell those stories. That you've got to be careful about how you present that information. So, the difficult stories, including from a lived experience of the racism that I had to endure and working from the age of 11 in the Indian restaurant trade. For me, through all of this, a number of questions arise. In the COVID age, when we reflect on the simple things we took for granted, would we even miss the museum if it shut down? Or is it a place that we step into when it's raining outside, I always ask? Does it remain a place for the already engaged? And how does it really help us grow and heal as a society? And I think during the COVID era, I think these questions have really surfaced when we start to really look at the things that we, perhaps really, what are the necessities in our lives? Through the project that we delivered, I started exploring the kind of notions of power and those who were beneath those in power. I took joy in leaving things untranslated, in fact, with audio and video. I placed English text below, in fact, Bengali text, as you can see here. And I became obsessed with wanting to present my community in brilliant, extraordinary form, a big, bold, quality aesthetic, unlike we never really see this before. So it was something that I became obsessed with, trying to present brilliantly my community. If I'm going to present the stories of people who have long been invisible, either do it brilliantly or otherwise I say, don't bother, just go home. The quality was matching and even exceeding that of major exhibits. And that for me was the first step to give real value to these people and these communities. I say we must appropriate these museums and take them as our own. I'm proud to be in part of appointing CEOs of our museum as people of color during my time as a trustee of Birmingham Museum that bring fresh perspectives in a hugely diverse city like Birmingham that has long been represented by people who don't really reflect the demographics of the people. The institutional voice that I always bang on about, to be honest, is that the institutional voice must be replaced with a more human one, and speak and be amongst the people. Be humble and really literally immerse yourself in the people. Not just at the museum, but the various steering groups and where I'm associate in various organizations. I've said, literally be amongst the people that live. Why not take your board meetings and your gatherings literally amongst the people where they live? Why are the people seen as something that is almost a far distant alien concept? And that, as I mentioned, is a tragedy. In a fractured, broken society where communities are increasingly polarized, how does a museum act as a space for people to converge, not just to learn about one another, but literally be with one another? Thank you.
Thank you, Mohammed, for that brilliant presentation and disrupting ideas around who museums are for, and this idea of the museum as the commons, as potentially could be the commons. Thank you for that. The next presentation is from Ahdaf Soueif. And Ahdaf is the author of the best-selling The Map of Love, shortlisted for the Booker Prize in 1999 and translated into more than 30 languages. Her account of the Egyptian Revolution of 2011, Cairo, A City Transformed, came out in January 2014. Her collection of essays, Mizatera, has been influential, and her article for The Guardian in the UK are published in the European and American press. In 2007, Ms. Soueif co-founded the Palestine Festival of Literature, which takes place annually in occupied Palestine. In 2020, after serving for 7 years, she resigned from the British Museum Board of Trustees. Without further ado, Ahdaf Soueif.
Hi everybody, and thank you, Orsod, and thank you to the Stuart Hall Foundation for inviting me. Slightly on false pretenses, because my involvement with the museum world has basically been being on the board of the British Museum and then resigning from it. But of course, there's also a personal story behind every story, and mine was that I first was taken to the British Museum at age 5 when we were in the UK. Both my parents were students on leave from their jobs in Egypt, and the museum was where they took their 5-year-old on the weekend. And I, looking back, I remember not being at all fond of the British Museum, that it was forbidding. I didn't relate to the Egyptian artifacts there. I was much happier in the Natural History Museum, or better still, in Battersea Fun Fair. But anyway, my mother was very fond of the British Museum as a scholar of English literature. She was actually fond of the reading room, which is no longer there, and was the happy possessor of a card to the British Museum reading room. And so there was a certain kind of loyalty that I felt to the place, which was why I went on the board. And it was at a very specific moment where a particular gallery had been opened, gallery in room 61. And it was a restoration of a particular tomb in Egypt, the tomb of Neb Amun. And it had been done, the gallery had been set up in a way that was really different from how the Egyptian collection had been curated in the museum before. It acknowledged the vandalism with which it had been acquired, that Henry Salt, who was the British, I can't remember, consul or representative or something in Egypt in the late 19th century, had actually sort of hacked away at the walls of this tomb to remove the paintings. But but the exhibition acknowledged that. The exhibition also presented the artifact, or presented ancient Egyptian life as part of a continuing life of Egypt, rather than as something that was dead and gone, and that, you know, Egypt now was nothing to do with ancient Egypt. And also it spoke about the paintings as art. It wasn't just ethnography and look, you know, what these people are wearing and so on. It was actually talking about the techniques that the artists used to achieve the effects that they did. And for me, that was a departure, and it was a departure very much in the right direction. Well, as you know, it was said in the introduction, and as people know, I stayed on the board for 7 years and eventually decided that the only way I could actually make a statement was by resigning. And the resignation was not specifically on the issue of decolonising, and this is the point one of the points I would like to make. It was actually to do with the extreme reluctance of the board, or, like, you know, the impossibility of getting the board to see why people, particularly young people, wanted them to cut their ties with BP or any big oil company. So it was that insensitivity to what I thought should be their primary audience, which is young people who are concerned about the future of the planet. And it was also an issue to do with workers' rights and what happened to workers who were outsourced after having been for many years part of the museum staff and so on. And then there was the issue of decolonisation and whether the museum was engaging with it or not. So I think decolonisation is supremely important, but I think that it is part of a wider constellation of ways of behaving that museums should be held to. As has been said, the museum as a commons, and the museum as a public space, and the museum as a place of education has a very serious responsibility, and the responsibility is to act ethically. And even without taking the museum today, calling the museum today to account for how they acquired their collection many years ago as a separate issue, it should be that museums are held to account to behave in ethically appropriate ways, appropriate for their context and appropriate for their time. So it's not enough at all to put the value of the museum at the fact that it gets, or got before COVID, 7 million visitors a year and was only second to the Tower of London in how it attracted tourists. That is nice, but it isn't a reason for the museum to exist or to be thought of as positive. Another point really is that I think that we need to be quite careful about which museums we're talking about. I mean, there is a kind of taxonomy of museums. I lived in Wimbledon for many years, and the Residents Association got a little flat and set up a Wimbledon museum in it, and people donated, spectacles that they found in their gardens and so on. And so a picture was created in that museum of local life. And that, I think, has a very cohesive function and a documentation function. And it's kind of a good thing that it seems to me in Britain particularly, people are fond of these categorizations and documentations. So I think that when we talk about decolonizing and so on, we're talking about the big civilizational museums, the museums that collected or accepted stuff that was taken from all over the world, and there the responsibility is really, really clear. And the involvement of people from the colonized countries is totally correct and necessary. The empire came to our countries and took this stuff with violence or coercion or shady deals. And the excuse that, one excuse is that London has so many different communities and they can all come and see these objects. Another is that people can see these objects right next to each other, and so scholars can draw associations and so on. But really this is the museum's role in creating the center beyond which everything is a margin. And the center has its point of view, has its stories that it puts forward, and there need to be other stories that are told, and other points of view that are on record. So whether it's the Banian bronzes, human remains, the Parthenon sculptures, this is all a room for a very rich and very important process that is now taking place. I think we need to move on.
Oh, sorry, I was on mute. Thank you, Ahdaf. Thank you so much. The next presentation is from Suhaiymah Manzoor-Khan, who will be delivering a poem for us today. Suhaiymah is an educator and poet who disrupts narratives of race, history, and knowledge in her writing and workshops. She is the author of Post-Colonial Banter, which came out in 2019. She's the host of the Breaking Binaries podcast, and she's also published in multiple anthologies and national media publications. Her work has millions of views online. And yes, without further ado, Suhaiymah, off you go.
Thank you. Thanks, Orsod. Yeah, I feel like there's already so many strands I want to pick up from what the other speakers have already mentioned. So I'll sort of dive into this poem as a provocation, and hopefully we can get chatting. This poem is called Where Is My History? And it was commissioned by a project going on in Birmingham, which was asking this question of the local narratives of history in the city. And I chose to respond kind of thinking about this question in three senses of where, which is maybe just relevant for me to mention before I read it. So the first was thinking about where in terms of within the subject of history, where is our history? So thinking about conversations around curriculums, textbooks, documentation, and what categories of history, whether it's like immigrant history, women's history, British history, global history, where is our history located? The second where was in terms of evidence, and obviously this is sort of where the museum comes into play. So what kind of artifacts are deemed historical and what are just deemed, a bit of rubbish or a scribble on a piece of paper? Where are our archives? What happens, for primarily oral cultures and histories? What counts as evidence of your existence? And thirdly, where as in ideologically? Where is our history deemed as history, or is it deemed as kind of alternative thought and ideas? So let me just go straight for it. My history is imprinted in the spaces between the ink printed on pressed pages. My history is the screams shouting out through the silent slots in syllabi. It is caged in glass cases said to be for its own safety by the institutions which narrate it as their own. Because my history lies in the choices not recorded about which stories should be hoarded and called archives. And my archives are the chicken shops, the taxi stops, the backseats of rentals, the inside hems of headscarves, women's conversations, women's congregations, women's contemplations, which you won't find in your local heritage site. No, because my history is the shame of your history, the body buried in the back garden with no gravestone, but in fact not so shameful, no, for it is also adorning your proudest buildings, the ones I'm searched before entering, as if my bringing something in would be disturbing, as if my things weren't already coveted and stolen, sorry, read salvaged and reallocated to make up these museums in the first place. It's almost as if history is less about what happened than maintaining ideology, because when you investigate a story with half the participants absent and don't worry about the translation, want only to fit the narrative to the nation, then is it surprising that what's surmised is that my history is not, that my past is culture and ancient kingdoms, never politics or philosophy. My ideas are religion and oriental, tribes, norms, and alternative remedies, whilst yours are universal teleologies and superior methodologies? No. It's no surprise my past is passed over and pushed into the peripheries despite being palpable in every premise of what gives Britain history. Because to find it would be to remember that if Britain is Tudors and Victorians, it is also slavers and plantations, the colonies and the colonised. To find my past would be to remember that every object in the museum that is said to be objectively seen was plundered and stripped of value for the perusal of researchers and big purses to spectate and win awards. Whilst those of us who are still seen as backwards, who don't get the time or space to explore artifacts, are in fact the outcome of their unnarrated relations to colonial plunder and false salvation. So when you ask where my past is, ask instead what yours is without mine. Thank you.
Thank you, Suhaiymah. There's a lot there, I think, from all of our speakers, and I'm really, really excited to get stuck into the conversation. So I'd like to invite Ahdaf and Mohammed back to the floor, I guess, the virtual floor. Hi. There's a lot there, and I would like to kind of start, actually. There are certain things, I think, that bind all of your presentations together. So I think, Mohammed, when you talked about making walls speak and breathing life into the inanimate, and then, you know, working with the, you know, the idea of transforming the museum as the commons, creating a public space, because it's presented as a public space, but we all know that that's not the case. And then Ahdaf, also echoing that when you're talking about responsibility to act ethically, but also reckoning with the histories and of the museum and the ways that the museum is structured, and the ideological positioning of the museum as well, whether it's conscious of it or not. So I really wanted to ask you all, I pose this question and ask you about narrative, and ask about, you know, how the museum can't be separated from the popularization of the museum at the same time as as colonialism and colonial extraction, taking objects, bringing it to the West. So how does the museum continue to monopolize narrative? And Mohammed, you've given us such an excellent example, actually, of how to disrupt that. But I think I'd like to pose that question. So how does the museum continue to monopolize and universalize narrative, to use your words?
Sorry, yeah. So what, you want me to go first?
Go ahead. Whoever, jump in.
Unless someone else wants to take it first.
Go for it, it's fun.
Yeah. Okay. So sorry. Simplify your question for me again, please. If you
yeah, sure. So how does the museum become such an exclusive space? You know, and how has it been such an exclusive space for such a long time? You know, how does it do that?
Okay, well, I'm going to throw in something that I've been thinking about recently, about how museums have been able to get away with so much without being challenged. And I always describe it, and I think it's not in museums, it's the kind of the age of social media. The discrete comments box that would be placed in a museum or in a public space that would invite people to feedback, where you could discreetly feedback, has almost imploded on itself through the advent of social media, where that discrete comments box cannot be ignored, cannot be passed on to a department within a department, where something will just get buried in a pile of feedback papers that never really get actioned upon. Now that discrete comments box literally is kind of out there for all to see, where that critique en masse with kind of, you know, with the social media means that museums and places like museums are forced into a corner almost. And that's, I believe, how museums have been able to kind of get away with being able to kind of carry on as they are, without people kind of, so it's the power of people, and the social media, I believe, really has kind of made that and changed that kind of whole dynamic.
I think to add to that as well, I think that there's something about the way that museums position themselves as both authoritative and neutral. And I think that sort of, I'm just remembering, you know, as a school child going on school trips to museums, it's a really big part of kind of an educational experience that's going to be really interactive. But within that is this assumption that everything you see is completely factual, you know, and there's no sort of there's, you know, there is no author, there is no authorial voice. Nobody's written these things. Nobody's, you know, no decisions have been made about where things are placed in the museum. And even, you know, thinking about the curatorial decisions that go into what you see, what you don't see, what's concealed, what's revealed. I mean, I was thinking about what you were mentioning, Ahdaf, about this conversation maybe pertaining more to the big civilizational museums. But I do think there's also something to be said about local, you know, there's a museum nearby in Leeds, a local museum, and the fact is, even the things that they're showing kind of in terms of social history in the last 100 years, these are still artifacts of coloniality, even though they're not, you know, sure, you know, the person down the street didn't go and kind of pillage it from somewhere, but somewhere down the line, there's an economic or material relationship to extraction. And I think that is important. And I remember having a conversation with one of the members of staff there in terms, their exhibition at the time I went was about 100 years of women's suffrage. And of course, it was 100 years of white women, British women's suffrage. And when I sort of mentioned this and sort of said that it's not reflective of the area and the people who live here, one of the things they said was that, you know, we can only work with the collections that we have, and people donate their private collections. And I just thought that was such a cop-out, because there's also then the question of, okay, so what does it mean that my grandparents wouldn't call their bags full of passports and you know, documentation private archives? They would just call that junk in the attic. And so how then is the museum accountable or responsible for reflecting those decisions? Because whilst the curator themselves is not personally responsible, there is a collective social responsibility, I think. So it's those, you know, there's all these things that are political that are then hidden under the guise of this is a neutral space. This is a very like objective piece of a space that you're walking through, basically. So yeah, I think that's part of it.
You know, I think as we speak that that in a way, we as brown people, as the ex-colonized, as the ones who are trying to push, you know, our history, our point of view in, we're kind of like not on our own playing field. I mean, people who cared about museums and set up these museums are the colonizers, you know? And it's not a form that is, I mean, of course we have, like, you know, we have museums now, but it was never the drive of people in our parts of the world to turn things into stuff to be looked at, you know. And so when they arrived as colonizers, I mean, there's one guy, I've been trying to find his name now because I came across him when I was doing work on Palestine, and he was a British ornithologist, and he's like famous for his categorizations of birds and how much he loved birds and admired birds. The fact is that he killed some massive number of little birds in Palestine, something like 10,000 birds, you know, that went into. And so this notion of being so fascinated about something and caring for it and wanting to study it, and actually you're killing it in order to do that is somehow, I mean, I just feel that there is a connection very much in that attitude to put there and study and measure people's skulls and all that, and colonization, as opposed to, I mean, this is a very simple way of putting it, but as opposed to the people who are living these lives that are being examined in this way. And so there's something like almost as though we need to sidestep that particular playing field and do something else to disrupt, you know, from within. I mean, this is a very unformed thought.
No, can I jump on that really quick? I think on what you're saying, I'm just thinking about, I think to me, this is the heart of the question around, you know, how can we decolonize, or can we, because the question I think you're also asking is this a function worth having in society? Yeah, and I think that's because I think what you just said there is the heart of it as well, in the sense that if we're living in a society or a world in which education is deemed to be this voyeuristic consumptive process where you consume in this way, it is also, as you say, steeped in these ideas of making intelligible and kind of stripping of its own meaning and on of its own terms, which I think when I was just making my notes earlier today, I was thinking, is this a function that we want to kind of reappropriate? And I don't know, I've not settled on an answer there, but that, to me, what you're saying is just a really important point.
Yeah, and may I just make another?
Of course, yeah, no, go ahead, yeah.
So then, speaking as an Egyptian, yeah, for example, on the one hand, I know that because of all the Egyptian artifacts that are in museums all over the world, and which were, gotten very badly, that's why ancient Egypt is so much on the map. And that's why people know about it. That's why there are all these storybooks. That's why every kid in the world knows to sort of, color in a picture of Nefertiti and so on. So they've acted as ambassadors for the culture. And it's not as if we particularly miss them. I mean, there's so much stuff in Egypt anyway, so it's not that. But then the issue of representation, and I guess that's what I'm, slightly felt a bit more comfortable about with Room 61. But the issue of representation, this thing of its being a dead culture and being somehow weird. And for example, at one time, the British Museum was doing an exhibition, which was nicely done, but it was the Egyptian Book of the Dead. And you say, well, you know what? Its actual title, which everybody now knows is its actual title, is The Book of Going Forth by Day, which is a very different concept from the Book of the Dead, but it's impossible because it's like, oh, but people know this. This is what people know. This is what people like. And so you're constantly like fighting against this view of a culture that that was obsessed with death. And but guys, actually, they loved life so much that they needed to believe it would continue. And that's why there are all these a culture that was obsessed with death. You go into an exhibition and the texts, and so the whole view is of a very weird people who did weird things and had weird art. And it's so unfair. And that goes for everybody, not just Egypt. It's just my particular. And so, do you want this representation? Is that the price that you have to pay?
Well, that actually, yeah, takes us on, because I do have questions about curation, so and this, I mean, how we tell histories, does convey in one way or another a particular political allegiance or ideological allegiance, and we see that. And I think some of the problems is that combines with power and who's telling the story, who's allowed to tell everyone's stories. And this is, again, so Mohammed, I feel the ways in which you've approached curation, and I've had a look at your work, and I've just really been, just pretty wowed by it, really, honestly. And I wonder if you could say a bit more in terms of this project, because it's not just the project that you presented, but it's also the project, I think it was called, Congregate 3.0, where you took over the museum, and this idea of really making the museum this, and I'm obsessed with this idea of the commons, really, because as you said, Suhaiymah, it's like, it's this idea that it conceals its power and pretends like it's the commons, but it isn't, and it takes someone like Mohammed to come along and be like, this is, so I wonder if you could say a bit more on your curatorial influences and inspirations.
I mean, yeah, okay. Coming from a street art background, I'm in a position where I am exploring the very notions of power and public space by literally taking over something by force. Even when you're actually not, right? Even when I'm painting a building, as I was doing earlier today, even if it's sanctioned art, there's still these notions of power of this individual going and taking over a space and doing what they wish. And similarly, with the example you gave of the exhibition, often when speaking to the community, I'd often show an image of the museum, this prestigious historic building, and they'd say, how did you get into there? How is that possible? How did you get our stories into such a building? Because there's a perception, they see the grandeur of the building and its aesthetic, and it's about kind of, for me, I kind of often I'd kind of play on that a little bit in terms of saying, you know, this is your damn building, right? This is your space. You fund this damn space, and it's about just changing their perceptions, and it's just, you know, about that kind of challenging of where they see themselves, and in a way doing so quite forcefully as well is almost required, right? As opposed to and that's kind of the things I've always enjoyed playing with, even if when for example you mentioned something called Congregate, which was a kind of a takeover of the museum. It actually wasn't a takeover. Well, you could argue it was, because nobody's asked me when I delivered that show. Nobody in the Birmingham Museum, it was a live stream show where we kind of transformed this traditional gallery space and did as we pleased, really. We brought some artists in and musicians and performed and had some really difficult conversations. Nobody's asked me or kind of checked in with me about what the themes are. We have taken over the space. But as I said, I think there's something quite exciting about when you literally are kind of framing it as a takeover. You are showing them that we are in power and control here, and we do as we please. And I think that excites the community and only opens up opportunities for them to kind of see themselves in such spaces.
Well, that's also very, I mean, that is a very effective and powerful way of relating to a space, isn't it? And it brings to my mind some of the work that people like BP or not BP are doing in the British Museum and Culture Unstained, where they put on these massive shows that are activist political shows, using the space and occupying the space to question and undermine.
I think that, because also, I think for me, the way I see a museum as well is also that it is itself a performance. It is a storytelling space. It is a theatrical space. So in a way, also, I think you guys doing those things, or whether it's the activists, like, I think that it kind of, as you say, it kind of reclaimed, like what you said, whether it's forcible or not forcible, it is forcible. And I think that's quite exciting. But I think actually listening to you as well, Mohammed, I'm just thinking about, it really matters that it was you doing it. Do you know what I mean? Like, it really matters on whose terms that occurs, because it was contrasting that with so last year the British Library, I think it's actually right now, they've got this exhibition called Unfinished Business, and it's again women's rights in the last 100 years. And this time around, there was this one well, there's lots of things I can say about it, but the one thing that I found really uncomfortable was that Khadija Say, who's the artist who sadly became like very nationally famous after was killed in the Grenfell fire of, corporate government manslaughter. And I was thinking about the fact that what does it mean to exhibit her work in this exhibition when I would query whether she would have been exhibited had she lived. And I think that's really like an uncomfortable thing to think about. And also to kind of put her within this narrative of women's rights in the last 100 years, and whether that's narrative that she wanted her work to be seen. Do you know what I mean? So I think that question of on whose terms as well becomes then really palpable to me, because I think my instinct in the response to this question was just like, no, like, the only function museum, only if museums become like, housing for undocumented people can they be reconstituted in any useful way. But actually, that's just making me think it really matters who's doing the work.
Absolutely. And I do also think, I mean, just to add to that, I do think that there's it matters who's doing the work, but then there's also this, yes, I think questions of curation really need to be interrogated in all of the ways that you mentioned. And I kind of want to bring us to this. I know there's not much time left. I feel like this conversation could go on for a while. But I just wanted to bring us to this word decolonize, just briefly. And it has reached this buzzword sort of status, and perhaps not even on our terms, right? So decolonize has reached this, buzzword status, and it talks about it as it's something that has happened. So it's happened, and we are in the process of reckoning with it, and we're doing our best. But then how can we begin? How can museums begin to reckon with or colonialism, when colonialism is still ongoing. So when we think about the North American colonies, when we think about Palestine, when we think about Australia, when we think about these places, how can the museum even begin, as almost like a linchpin, for all of these power relations? Can we begin, can the museum really begin to, I think Ariella Zule said, you can't decolonize the museum without decolonizing the world. And I wonder what you all thought about that.
Well, I keep thinking again of the British Museum as though you could take that amazing building, and that is an exhibit, that it's like, and actually that was one of the things that I sort of tried to suggest. You can imagine how well that went down when there was a lot of work on refurbishing and so on. And I was like, well, the museum itself is an object, and to tell the story of how it came into being and how it acquired its collections, and how people sort of came to see it as the center that they would put their things into, and how it grew. That would be really neat. It's not going to happen, but I think that would be, I think that would be a hell of an exhibition to do.
I think, also just, I think when I think of decolonizing as well, it is very much an act of, there's got to be divestment and revealing in that way. And I do think if it was to reveal itself as an artifact, that's possibly the only path that kind of make sense. But also I was just thinking about what you were talking about BP earlier, and just thinking about, it's not only like occupied territories, but it's also the fact that there are ongoing, because I think when we think about the museum as a colonial space, that's ideological and material. And if you have collaboration with corporations that are directly invested in environmental catastrophe that displaces people across the world, who then come to our borders and we deport them, detain them, all these different kind of violences that this state is involved with, that is then also kind of propping up this narrative of the nation as global, as empire. There's just like a lot of layers to that. And I was thinking about, who cleans these museums, who's the security on the door of the museums. And I think, to me, there's got to be that material as well as ideological shift. And I think the ideological is the bit that seems to be kind of easier to patch over, in the sense that, I saw actually on the British Museum website earlier today, there's this, it was an object trail that was sort of like showing you the colonial history of certain objects, but you read the captions and they're just like descriptive, they're just really, one of them was just like, oh, this was acquired by the London Missionary Society when they converted people in this island. And it's kind of like, there's some questions and context that remain. There's some very interesting acquired, like the language here. So I sorry, this is not really a clear thought, but just thinking about material and the ideological, and kind of how maybe also what you're saying about decolonizing becoming a buzzword, also the fact that I think it's been very actively co-opted deliberately by the ideological kind of PR image elements, because that now becomes a reason to continue visiting the museum as well. So just
almost reluctantly, but what are your thoughts, Mohammed?
I just want to, let me just stop for a minute. Decolonization here, this word you're talking about, right? I have to admit, I'm going to just break it down here. What are we talking about here exactly? Because I don't understand, right? I come from a background which was dealing with drunks on a Friday night, right? Drunks who would call you X, Y, and Z, all these other terms, and you'd have to deal with these scumbags, right? That's the world I come from. And I see what we're talking about decolonization is, I was speaking with the CEO of Birmingham Museum earlier, actually, but we're talking about anti-racism, right? We're talking about, the racist structures around us. So translating decolonization into kind of layperson speak, if you like, is we're talking about racism and racist structures that tell people stories for us and actually manipulate the structure in order to kind of put people in their place. So we're talking about racism, simple as. So when you mentioned about we can't decolonize the museum until we decolonize the world, well, actually, I think there's the museums can be at the heart of it and should be at the heart of just doing plain old simple anti-racism work. Simple as that for me.
What did you wanted to come in, Ahdaf?
No, I think that's a very neat way of, just bringing a bit of focus into the into this sort of like intellectual swirl that that a practical thing would be for the museums, and that to do anti-racist work, and going to Suhaiymah saying, is it worth it? You know, is it worth actually trying to take over the space on that playing field? I mean, obviously, if you could leave it aside and go and just do the other things with your life that you wanted to do. But the thing is that they exist and they continue telling the stories. They continue controlling the narrative to a large extent because of their status and their heft and the number of people from all over the world that pass through their doors. So it's a battle that has to be fought. And so, yes, I mean, race is central to all of it, to colonialism, to empire, to, you know, the whole thing. And so pushing for anti-racist activities or activities revealing the extent to which race has controlled the collection and the vision behind it and the curating of it would probably be a pretty revolutionary and pretty productive and useful thing to do.
Suhaiymah, I'll give you the last word. Sorry, we have to go to questions, but I could.
Okay, sure. No, I was just going to be really cynical and just say that I suppose anti-racism as well itself, though, has kind of been now diluted into equality, diversity, inclusivity. Like, let's have the Priti Patels and the Sajid Javids on the board of, you know, such and such thing. And I think I love the idea of the museum being an anti-racist space, but I think that then does require us to define that further, right? And be like, okay, what that literally means is this. It doesn't mean you just, you know, because I think that's not, in a way, that's just a problem of capitalism, right? It's a problem of living under neoliberalism, that everything will become an advertising tool. Everything will just become another way of maintaining the same things. But yeah, sorry, just wanted to add that cynical thought. That was all.
I don't think that's a cynical thought. I think this is how how the dialogue kind of manifests, and I think all of these questions are really, really important, I think, and especially the ways that we define anti-racism. How do we define decolonization? And also, how do we make this discourse accessible? How do we make this discourse available for everyone to use, to enact, to explore, and to advance? And I really think those are really some interesting points. And with that, I'll move us over to questions, but I just want to say that I could have stayed on this call for another couple of hours, but let me move on. So we have, if you guys spot any questions as well, let me know. But I'll start with this one. So this is from an anonymous attendee, and it says, what responsibilities does the curriculum have in preparing us for encountering the work within museums and even art galleries, and being able to contextualize its artifacts within the social structures we currently live under? Or is it the museum that needs to fill in the pedagogical gaps within the classroom? So I think the question is, who does the responsibility fall on to prepare young people to go into the museums as we know it now? And to be able to analyze this stuff and to think critically about it. So yeah, what do you think?
Not going to happen, really, is it? Because it's all a system, and so schools are not going to teach children. Well, I don't know. Maybe primary schools with forward-thinking teachers might actually use school trips as a tool to sharpen their students' critical and research faculties, maybe. But I don't think we can absolve the museums of responsibility to, you know, do that to themselves, really.
I think it also just speaks to the larger question of like what kind of education do we want? Like, what do we want education to be? Like, does it have to be this binary of in school, outside of school, or you know, like, and realistically, where we engage with the most critical questions aren't, I mean, it's kind of like what Mohammed was just saying, it's not going to be in school, in a museum, it's going to be in whatever you're experiencing day to day, wherever you are in, you know, yeah, I think the responsibility is a much more kind of, that's a huge collective question, in my opinion.
Any thoughts, Mohammed?
No,
Yeah. Oh, you guys might have to help me out here, actually.
Well, I just want to say something about this last question, because
Sure.
I think that what you're looking for in a museum is that when a young person enters it, they find something that speaks to them of themselves. They're not meant to be just looking at sort of, weird and wonderful. I mean, they should somehow relate to things and understand, get a sense of kind of common humanity or just basics of human life, stuff like that. And that is what we should be looking for in terms of education in the role of museums. And they should be the tool for that to happen, to complement what, life in schools are teaching them. But I'm sorry, you go ahead. What was it that you wanted to help with?
Just so if you tap on the Q&A box, there's some questions in there. If you spot any that you want to answer, do let me know. There is a question about the difficulties of working in the museum as a person of color. Let me just.
They were very.
So can POCs belong to a museum as staff? Actually, working in a museum comes with a whole host of other issues: institutional racism, microaggressions, white privilege, power, and decision-making held by a tiny minority of white staff who do not understand racism. How do you suggest people of color museum staff might begin to tackle such issues when they face being marginalized and silenced and even let go? I think that's a really important question, especially in the light of COVID and a lot of the jobs that a lot of the people that had to be let go. So I wonder if you had any thoughts.
Oh, I was just going to say the thing that comes to mind is not my own thoughts, but I know Shaheen Kasmani and Samir Kasim, who were part, and other co-collaborators were part of putting on the Past Is Now exhibition a couple of years ago. And one thing that they spoke about in response to kind of how it went down was that they were all women of color who were kind of commissioned in freelance capacity to kind of put on this decolonised exhibition. And they were just talking about absolutely what this person said in the questions, the kind of not only the difficulties in the decision making, but also the amount of labor that was kind of put onto them, and the way their thoughts were extracted, and all of that was kind of taken from them, low pay, but also little kind of authority over decisions that were actually really fundamental to the exhibition. And they've written about this online, so I'd really recommend reading that. And the other thing I just wanted to say on this point was, it brings another thought to mind, which is that, so with the Unfinished Business exhibition, the British Library one, I was involved to a very small degree, just like kind of had a conversation with one of the curators in a podcast we were recording, and she'd been really like very careful, I think, in her thinking about, how to put this together. This is like not wanting to exclude or erase, and just having like a really complex time with it. And then on the night of the launch of the exhibition itself, the first person to speak in the entire thing was a woman who I'd never come across, who was the funder of the actual exhibition in private equity, some sort of international private equity. And the first thing she said was, women's rights have been achieved in the UK, but it's unfinished business elsewhere. And I just thought this is so interesting, because no matter how much work has gone into this on a curatorial level or the people involved on the ground, you in one sentence have framed this as a completely, civilizational colonial project. And so I don't have an answer, but it's just a reflection where I was kind of thinking about where the power is made as well, and how, again, to me, that links again to the material element of funding and who kind of gets to place that final stamp, I guess, that final mark on things. But I don't know, never worked in a museum, so I have no idea.
Well, with issues like this, we're always thinking of collectivity, of people somehow forming. I mean, I don't know. I don't want to say unionize like some sort of old lefty, but it's something like that. It's something like sort of creating bodies or groups or whatever with more power than an individual person.
There's actually a really interesting question here, and I would love to hear your thoughts on it. It's do we need more themed museums? So in Liverpool we have the International Slavery Museum. Would a dedicated museum of colonialism be be a useful tool for decolonising museum up and down the country? And I think that's a really ropey question, but I wonder what you guys think. Mohammed, do you have any thoughts in terms of just?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest with you, I was going to comment on, just make a comment on the previous one.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah, feel free.
Yeah, I mean, it was about kind of making change and myself being a trustee. And one thing I'd say very, very clear is that being a trustee of a museum has been very challenging. You know, there's times where I've been at the table where I've, been very, very, disillusioned, right? And it continued to be, and it is a struggle. I'm not saying, it's all hunky-dory now, right? However, my voice has been necessary to be able to, and when I've been able to speak to staff or speak to even when it comes to catering stuff, where I'm talking to the Bangladeshi fellow who's telling me I can cook curry, but I don't know why we don't have curry on the menu, for example. I know I keep going about curry and I might be a bit biased there, right? But the point is being able to relay those stories and kind of that being able to challenge. Something I always say to our community, to be honest with you, I always say to them, now do you see why you need to be in these positions, whether it's trustees or being on boards. I know it's a bit of an old cliche to say be on boards to make that change, but I'm telling you on a ground level, I'll say become, get into those positions. That's how things are going to change. So, for example, one classic example: Birmingham Museum and Art Gallery employed 2 co-CEOs, one a female of Pakistani heritage and a male of African heritage, who are now in the role of CEO of the museum. And I'm very excited about the possibilities, and I was quite fortunate and blessed to be in the part of that process to select them into position. So I'm very excited and optimistic about where we might be going forward for now. Just so that question was quite heavy about people of color in the museum and anti-racism work, but I'm optimistic, and that change needs to happen on a very simple level. Our people, our communities need to be in these positions to speak truth to power.
Does anyone want to respond to Mohammed's point, or there's also this question here. So, do we need more themed museums? So, this idea of there's a slavery museum in Liverpool. Should there be a dedicated museum to colonialism?
Aren't all museums to colonialism? Aren't all museums to slavery? I guess that's, it depends what would be the point when everything is, I don't know. Yeah, my response would just be surely they all are already.
I would say on a practical level, would I like to see it kind of siphoned off as a separate institution that only certain people will go to? Not really. I'd like to see it in the spaces where everybody can't, you cannot avoid it. You might go in and see something else, but you are going to see that. As soon as you separate it off, I'm not sure I see the logic of that, to be honest.
Ahdaf, did you have?
No, I agree. I think. I mean, on the face of it, yeah, it's a nice idea, but I think there'd be a certain amount of tokenism, and I think there'd be a feeling that we've done that now. We've got that museum about colonialism. So now we can just carry on being the way we are. So no, I think not. I think it needs to be, pushed into the existing spaces.
It's interesting, actually, because I remember going to, I think it was a Soul of the Nation exhibition, I think back in 2016, I think it was, where it was on the civil rights movement, etc. And sometimes I feel when resistance is put in the museum, it almost totally dies, right? So when something, resistance to something that is ongoing or continuing, then gets placed in a museum. So, for instance, the Colston statue very recently is now sitting in, with the paint on it and everything. It's sitting in the Bristol Museum. So I wonder, that's why I think it's a bit of a ropey one, because I think the minute you lay a museum to colonialism, that's even more reason to say that it's over. We need to get over it. We're on to the next thing, and we haven't reckoned with it at all. So
I just have a thought here that there was, again, at the time that I joined, or just before, there was a run of exhibitions, of star exhibitions at the British Museum, which seemed to me to be doing what a museum was, what I would want a museum to do. So there was a big Iraq museum, Iraq exhibition at the point when Britain and the United States were bombing Iraq and sort of laying waste to it and so on. And there was this whole discourse all the time about Sunni Shiite and tribal societies, and there was this massive exhibition about Iraqi civilization. There was also then an Afghanistan exhibition, and there was also one about Shah Abbas, Iran, and there was a Hajj exhibition. Now, these were the museum actually working in counterpoint to what the government was doing. And it was treading a fine line because, of course, it gets government funding and has to get government funding, and therefore, but it was telling a story that was opposed to the actions of the government of the time. It was using, of course, the collections that were acquired in, bad ways, but it was using them to do this, to set up this opposing view, and it was powerful. And I sort of kind of thought they would go on doing that, but it didn't. But there was a good stretch there.
I wonder if there's also something there about then having maybe having the live conversation. Maybe there needs to be the live engagement and the current voice, because I think I agree with you also that it makes it seem over. And I think just think about what you said, Ahdaf, I guess if I'm imagining as someone who never goes to museums, if I went there and I was like, oh, okay, I see that now we're allowed to have a live conversation, there's people who are actually of this experience talking, that feels like it kind of makes it relevant and reminds us that it's right now. And I don't know, that's, just thinking aloud, is that a way that you can also make it kind of present?
It would not be easy, and it would be like the difference between deploying an old style standing army or sort of little fast reaction units, because you would have to have your finger on the pulse of what's happening, what's likely to be happening in a couple of months, and set things up.
True.
But it would be I think it would be tremendously good and useful, and it would be a way of contributing to debate and conversation, which would use, their ill-gotten treasures.
I'm afraid our time is up, unfortunately. But I want to thank you all so much for this really lucid and just really great conversation and such great inputs and so thank you all. I think that's it. So I'll ask you guys to switch off your cameras.
Thank you for sharing. This was a really good panel, and thank you for the sharing.
Oh no, thank you for joining us. Thank you so much. And yeah, I'll close out and I'll see you in the green room. Thank you to our audiences and I'm sorry we weren't able to get to all of the questions, but thank you to all of our audiences for attending. I just have a couple of messages before we sign off. The first one is that the Reconstruction Work Programme is going to take a little break until autumn, so until about September time. But please keep up with our videos. All of our conversations are on our website on the Explore section. So please visit our website and spend some time on there. We're really happy with the portfolio that we're building. And that includes our Imagine Futures series, which Suhaiymah has contributed to. So please get on there and read her article, as well as the many other brilliant articles on there. And this event is supported by Arts Council and the Centre on the Dynamics of Ethnicity, Code. And please don't forget that we do have the Innova residency, which applications close I think next week, so please get your applications in. It's a really great opportunity to be in the Stuart Hall Library, which is a fantastic space with a lot of excellent resources. And thank you so much to our speakers. And I hope that this I hope the conversation continues amongst you all. Thank you very much and good night.